I want to go back to chapter 2 of book 3. And I want to do one topic in philosophy of aesthetics, drawing upon chapter 2 of book 3, before we move on to other topics in chapters, or in books 8 and 9. So again, we are moving at a fast pace through a variety of different topics. And we're looking right now at a topic in philosophy of aesthetics. Okay, so if you recall, in chapter 2 of book 3, Augustine is talking about his experiences at the theater. And I'll just read here. He says, today I still feel compassion, but in those days at the theater I felt joy together with the lovers when by shameful means they had joy in one another, although those things were only pretended in the show, and when they lost each other I became sad like one who feels compassion. Okay, I think Augustine takes an entirely too pessimistic view of theater in the course of this passage. He seems to be very afraid of it and afraid of its power over our character states. Okay, and that's primarily his interest, is in the power of art to move us. He thinks that it's more powerful than argumentation. We can talk all day today about philosophical arguments. If we can get to them today, we'll be doing some of Aquinas' arguments for God's existence. But those arguments don't mean anything in comparison to the power of story. Story and art can move us, Augustine thinks, in ways that are much, much greater than mere argumentation alone. And this concerns him. He's really worried about that. He's worried about what it can do to his character when, in certain circumstances, perhaps he is moved by stories that he would not in real life be willing to be moved by. Okay, or when something like a murder or something happens, he would not abide that in real life, but when it happens in art, in a movie for us, or in theater for him, it's something that he's willing to give a free pass to. Okay, I want to talk, last time, if you look at the lecture, once I do upload it, you'll see a bit of a discussion about that already in our class. But I want to talk today about a related issue in aesthetics, and that is the issue of relativism. Okay, so I mean here a number of different topics in aesthetics, so areas of aesthetics, we might say. So visual art, let me just put that here. Music, movies, theater, etc. Okay, now, when I talk about relativism in aesthetics, I mean perhaps the main issue in philosophy of aesthetics. Yes?
Why do you qualify music as
Visual art, I mean really pictures.
You can't see music, you only hear it, right?
Correct.
So how is music like visual?
Oh, music is not a visual art. I'm sorry. This is a list of different forms of art.
Oh.
Yeah. I'm not including that as the title at the top. We could also add literary art, like poetry, to this, for instance.
Those were the subtopics of.
No, not at all. Okay. Now, perhaps the biggest issue in philosophy of aesthetics is the issue of standards across different works of art. Okay, so I remember. Shortly before the pandemic, visiting the MFAH, and you can go there, and in a particular room, at least at that time, you can see this big canvas, white canvas with a red ball on it, okay? Red ball right in the middle, okay? I remember standing there looking at that, brightly colored red ball on the canvas and thinking to myself, this is stupid. Okay. I have a 5-year-old. My 5-year-old could do this. She knows how to draw circles. And a lot of people have that kind of a reaction to modern art. Yet those who are into modern art say that the rest of us we just don't get it. Okay, we don't get the power of this piece to force us to contemplate ideas or think about things that we might not otherwise be able to encounter. Okay? And the idea, as I understand it in most modern art, is that it is not about you receiving from the canvas a particular something, but rather you imposing upon the canvas certain ideas that are inspired or created within you by virtue of your observation of the canvas. Okay, so you see the red ball, and that makes you have an artistic experience because you think of some artistic, endeavor as a result of seeing the red ball. Okay, if you take like really abstract forms of modern art, like Jackson Pollock's canvases. Have you guys ever heard of Jackson Pollock?
He's the one that did like just throwing paint in the canvas, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So he would lay out enormous canvases in his New York studio, and he would take cans of paint, like buckets of paint, and he'd just, throw the paint across the canvas. And wherever it landed, that is where it landed and stayed. And people have paid tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions at this point for Jackson Pollock's. Okay, now, but the point I think in a Pollock is always you're supposed to observe and think it's supposed to inspire you, make you think about things in ways that you otherwise wouldn't be able to think about them by virtue of observing a piece of art. Okay, whatever, all right. Okay, are some pieces of visual art superior to others? In other words, are there standards, or ought there to be standards in visual art where you can say, juxtaposing, I don't know, a Rembrandt. You guys all have heard of Rembrandt? Yes? Know who Rembrandt is? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Famous Dutch painter from the 17th century, really famous, okay? Maybe like a Michelangelo. Everybody's heard of Michelangelo? Okay. You can juxtapose a Michelangelo with our red ball or a Jackson Pollock. Is one superior to the other? See, there we have it right there. Okay, I think some of us are going to say pretty clearly yes, and others will say no. There are no standards in art. It's all just whatever we think. Okay, for those of us who say yes, there are standards, what are those standards? Time and effort. Okay, actually, let's put some of those up here. Okay, so we're looking at potential standards to separate some forms of art from others. Time and effort. Okay, I think that's a promising standard. Certainly Beethoven put a whole bunch more into his Ninth Symphony than my 5-year-old daughter puts into the little kazoo that she plays. That's like a lot of time and effort. It's a difference there, okay? But at the same time, if I were to spend a lot of time and effort painting, like a lot of time and effort, I might not produce anything so good as something that a real artist could do in just a matter of 5 minutes. Execution. Okay. So what does that mean? Is that like complexity? Okay, time and effort. Okay, and that's what we're aiming at, is what counts as good or bad in art, is what we're aiming at. Like, what qualifies it as good or bad. Okay, some would say complexity. Okay, so have you ever been driving on the Houston highways listening to the radio? I know people don't really listen to the radio much these days anyway, but listen to the radio and you listen to the pop music being played and you think to yourself, this is really repetitive and simple, right? I could do this. I mean, I don't have great musical talents, but like I could play this chord progression, right? This is not very hard. How did this person get on the radio and I'm not? Okay. And in comparison to like great works of music, Mozart symphonies or something like that, Katy Perry's music might come across as much less complex, but does that make it inferior? Okay, good. All right, good. So here's another set of standards. Can you expand on that? In the eye of the beholder. What does that mean?
Different people have different reactions to music and art. Some people might enjoy a certain painting because of the emotion that it instills in them, or the time period it was created in, the style, and other people who don't. Because my dad loves classical music. I don't get it, but he likes the emotion it produces in him and the style. I'm not into that. I'm into the
Okay, good, excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, so the opinions of the people who encounter it, are all opinions equal? If you were to ask the great majority of Americans whether they would prefer to listen to Katy Perry or to Beethoven, they would say Katy Perry. They would prefer Last Friday Night over the Ninth Symphony, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so, because like it speaks to their personal experiences much more than the Ninth Symphony does. I don't know why. Okay, but at any rate, right? Okay, so is it all public opinion, or is it like educated public opinion that counts?
Well, I mean, it really,
It's the question, isn't it, right?
it's like sections that make the art, like it's who you're aiming at. You're aiming at it because you put a lot of time and effort into it, or because it's very complex, or because it appeals to the public.
Sure. Okay, good. Another, there are other standards we could point to, like symmetry, or maybe influence. That's something that you could point to. These are, again, potential standards for identifying what counts as better art than other pieces of art. Okay, you could, these things like complexity and symmetry are internal to the work of art. Other things are actually external to it, like influence or public opinion. Okay, and this is a reference to the source of the art, the author of the text, or the creator of the music, as an attempt to identify standards. We could put other kinds of standards up here on the board. I think most of us have the strong intuition that there are standards in art, and that some pieces of art are better than others, like inherently better than others. But when it comes to like pointing out why exactly some pieces of art are better than others, it kind of breaks down and people start to differ from each other. And it's really hard to actually figure out why the Michelangelo is superior to the red ball on the white canvas. Okay, what do you guys think? Are you guys, like, are we naturally in our class relativists about the topic of standards in art, or we're universalists and would we rather say that there's no comparison, like it's just all equal, or would we rather say that some things are superior to others and maybe we can point to why? What do we think?
Personally, I think we're pretty hard on judgment on like any contemporary thing,
Mm-hmm.
and we consider like classics superior in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of hard to judge it with sort of that time or state of thought, where the classics are viewed automatically as great works of art. And then
Sure.
Contemporary.
And part of what gives them the status that they have is the kinds of standards that we have listed up here. Influence over a long period of time. Quite frankly, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony has been one of the most influential pieces of music the world has ever encountered. And Katy Perry's music has been very influential too, right? Lady Gaga's music is very influential too. Will it be that influential 200 years from now? Almost certainly not. Right? So it will probably pass away long before their own deaths in the minds of the public. Although I saw actually that, who's that old-timey singer dude who's palling around with Lady Gaga? Tony Bennett. He's still like singing. You guys ever heard of him? He's from the 1950s. He's in his 90s. He's like 95, and he just recorded an album a couple years ago with Lady Gaga. Okay, yeah, they came to Sugarland, to like the financial center, and did a concert there together. Okay, but you know, actually, part of the classics might just be raw power. Maybe that's part of what makes them what they are. I remember when I first encountered rap. Okay, And rap comes out of a people group that doesn't have much power in society. Yes? Everybody agree? Okay. And rap talks about that, right? These guys who are rapping, they talk about that. That's one of the things they rap about. Don't make me rap, I can't do it. And I remember encountering it, I was a teenager, and I remember listening to it and thinking, this is really complex stuff. If this came out of the establishment, this would be art. Because it's really, really complex stuff. Like if you guys have ever heard, really gotten into like good rap and listened to good rap, it's actually quite impressive. And it passes tests of complexity and symmetry and stuff. And time and effort and stuff like that, okay? So maybe part of what's going on is power, because rap doesn't have the status of art or high art or good art or something like that in our society, primarily because it doesn't come out of high socioeconomic circles. Is that correct? Would you guys agree with that? I think that that's probably the case. Yeah. There's a reason why classical music is played in concert halls and rap is played on street corners in people's, headphones, right? It's because one comes out of a certain socioeconomic background and the other doesn't. Maybe that plays part of what we would say is accounts for standards in art, and yet it can't play all of that role, because quite clearly the music that is played in concert halls as classical music passes tests of extraordinary complexity and symmetry and time and effort, and even public opinion. Like it passes all those tests and would count as very, very good art according to most of those standards. Okay. Maybe people's opinions differ based on what kind of art it is. So are some movies inherently superior to others? Like just better?
Yes.
Okay, so I agree. Like Texas Chainsaw Massacre is just a bad movie.
Or like when that bird attacking one movie.
Oh, like The Birds? You mean The Birds?
I think it's the bird.
The Hitchcock film The Birds? I have not seen that, so I've heard interesting things about it, I'll say.
Or like a Sharknado. They're so bad that they're good.
Okay. Yeah, so like there's some like slasher films, that sort of thing. It's like, this is like really bad film. And if you compare it to like stuff that's got the imprimatur of power, like Schindler's List or Private Ryan or something like that, or not necessarily even a Spielberg film, like a Scorsese film or one of the other great directors of our time, often that's the distinguishing feature. So again, I think in this case, as well as in visual art and music, I think that most of us have the intuition that some forms of art are better than others, but it's hard to actually put your finger on what precisely it is that makes some form of art better than others, or some movies better than others. Okay, something to think about, and it's raised by some of the ideas that Augustine has here. Again, we're just using this text in this particular case as a way to think about some larger philosophical issues. Does anybody have any last thoughts on the topic of relativism and aesthetics? Okay, the ability to actually speak to others and they feel it as meaningful as they encounter it? Yeah. Okay, interesting. Wow, that's really fascinating. So, if I come up with beautiful calligraphy in a private language, that's not art if you can't.
Like communication wise, but if I saw the calligraphy and I was like, wow, it's really beautiful, then like you interact with it. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Like that sort of thing.
Okay, so it wasn't like a deep communication, but it was a communication of a
Like,
sort.
if you eat a food dish and it's like really good, and you're like, oh wow, that was a masterpiece.
Sure.
That sort of thing.
Sure. And really good art, honestly, can speak to people at very different levels.
Yeah.
So really good art can, like an amazing piece of music, can be heard by a fabulous world-class musician and experienced at a deep level, and it can also be heard by popular level people who don't understand what they don't even know what a chord progression is, much less what dynamics are or tempo or anything like that, and they can also feel moved by it. Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. Is anybody like a hardcore relativist in aesthetics here? Would anybody say, it's all equal. So, okay, what do I mean? So like Lady Gaga versus Brahms. He's a famous composer. I could pick somebody else.
I would say that, I'm not a relativist, but I would say they have their place with each, I'm not gonna say one is better than the other, because it's purely made for different kinds of people, you know?
Sure.
One isn't better than the other just because I don't like it, or, I mean, it's meant for a different audience, you know?
Sure. Okay. All right. Fair enough.
But I'm not gonna say it's like all equal.
That's a pretty relativist statement, but not fully relativist. Because presumably, just depending on your particular background, something could count as art, which is a pretty relativist kind of a statement
Also,
to make.
that really just counts for music and art, not movies and food. Not all movies are created equal, not all food's created equal, there's some definite.
Generally speaking, the more educated people are in a particular art form, the more they are aesthetic universalists and say there are definitely some forms of art that are superior to others. And the less educated people are in a particular art form, the more they tend to be relativists and say it's all equal.
I just feel like anybody can make something great as much as they can make something bad.
Right?
So like somebody like Jay-Z can make like a bad song, then like some dude in his mom's basement can make like the best song ever.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. I think that's definitely the case. Yeah. Good. Okay, let us move on to another topic. We've got one more topic in Augustine that I want to try to get to today, and it's actually a biographical topic in this text. So if you'll open up your text, and we'll look at Book 8. Oh, I lied. There are two more topics I want to cover. Okay, two more topics. I'll just try to cover it real fast. If you look at Book 8, Chapter 8 especially, put your finger there, we'll read from it momentarily. Augustine is converted to Christianity in Book 8. Okay, and this is a very famous, like really famous, perhaps the most influential and famous conversion seen in the history of literature. He is not a Christian prior to that, primarily out of moral objections. Okay, he is intellectually convinced. He believes that the most convincing account of the origins of the world and of the nature of good and evil around him and of the realities of the human condition is the Christian account. So he is intellectually convinced prior to this scene, but he is not morally willing to become a Christian. Okay, he is afraid that he's going to have to give up his lifestyle, especially his sexual addiction, in order to be a good Christian. And I mean, I respect that about him. What's that? I didn't.
It wasn't a lie.
No, he's right. Yeah, I respect that about him. Like, I really respect that. I think this guy gets it. So many people these days think that Christianity is just a series of intellectual convictions and not actually a lifestyle. And so they give assent, maybe as kind of an insurance policy, so when they die, they actually get to get rewards, right? But they don't want to make hard choices to actually live a certain way, to be honest in their dealings with others, or to care for the impoverished, or to be sexually faithful, or something like that. And Augustine really gets that, and he doesn't want to commit to a worldview that he doesn't think he can hold. So I respect that about him. I remember reading not too long ago this essay by Frederick Douglass. You guys all have heard of Frederick Douglass? Know who he was? Yes? Great 19th century American activist against slavery. Okay, and Douglass said in this essay, he said, these plantation owners go to church on Sunday, and then the next day they're whipping the slaves, some of whom are their own children. Right, because they had, raped or assaulted slaves, and they had given birth to children, right? And Douglas was saying, this is like the height of hypocrisy. These are clearly people who had a serious disconnect between their intellectual assent to Christian principles and their lives and practice. But Augustine is not that way. He gets it. He understands that he's going to have to live differently. And then there's this famous scene where he turns to Christianity. Let me go ahead and read a little bit of it so that you guys can get a taste of this famous scene, so you at least have encountered it in class. I'm actually going to start in chapter 12, which is like towards the end of the conversion experience, okay? He's in Milan in northern Italy, and he's in great personal tumult because, chapter 12 of book 8.
Voice as a child?
Yeah, Voices of a Child, yeah. He's in Milan in northern Italy. He's in great personal tumult. He feels this incredible struggle within himself. Like he wants to become a Christian, but he doesn't want to become a Christian. Because he kind of wants the upside, the ability to explain the world, the ability to feel personal confidence and relief from his questions. But he doesn't want the downside, which as he sees it is this lifestyle change. Okay, and he says here, he's in this garden. He says, so I had arisen, he's talking about Alypius, his friend, I had arisen while he in deep wonder remained there where we were sitting. I flung myself down, how I do not know, under a certain fig tree and gave free rein to my tears. The floods burst from my eyes, not indeed in these words, but to this effect I spoke many things to you. O Lord, how long, O Lord, will you be angry forever? Remember not our past iniquities. Okay, such words I spoke with most bitter contrition. I wept within my heart, and lo, I heard from a nearby house a voice like that of a boy or a girl, I know not which, chanting and repeating over and over, take up and read, take up and read. Instantly, with altered countenance, I began to think most intently whether children made use of any such chant in some kind of game. Okay, I checked the flow of my tears and got up, for I interpreted this solely as a command given to me by God to open the book and read the first chapter I should come upon. So I hurried back to the spot where Alypius was sitting, for I had put there the volume of the apostle. When I got up and left him, I snatched it up, opened it, and read in silence the chapter on which my eyes first fell. Not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and impurities, not in strife and envying, but put you on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh in its concupiscences. Okay, that's Romans 12, 1 and 2, which basically says, alter your life as part of being a Christian. Okay, and no further wished I to read, nor was there need to do so. Instead, instantly, in truth, at the end of the sentence, as if before a peaceful light streaming into my heart, all the dark shadows of doubt fled away. Okay, so he becomes a Christian in this scene. This is the famous tolle lege scene. Tolle lege is Latin for take up and read, take up and read. And this child says that as part of a game, and he interprets this as an opportunity to take up the scriptures and read what his eyes first fall upon. Okay, notice that this is a moral conversion and not an intellectual conversion. Okay, he is probably already intellectually assenting to Christianity at this point, but he does make a moral step at this point. I remember reading, and I've shared this in class before, I believe once. I remember reading a couple years ago an essay by a very famous philosopher, Thomas Nagel, and it was written in the New York Review of Books. And he said, you know, there are good arguments for God's existence, and there are good arguments against God's existence, but he said, at the end of the day, I choose not to believe in God. And the reason why I don't want to believe in God is because I don't want to give up my lifestyle. I like my lifestyle. And I think the implication was his sexual lifestyle, I'm not sure. He said, I like my lifestyle, and I'd have to give that up if I were to, if God were to exist. And I thought, as I was reading that, I didn't agree with his conclusion, but I thought to myself, this is a very honest essay. I really appreciate this essay. Like, how many people are willing to write an essay like this and say this publicly? Even though everybody might privately be thinking these kinds of thoughts and basing their worldview on the kind of lifestyle they're willing to live, still, who says that sort of thing publicly? Instead, people try to appeal to objective things that are independent of them in order to justify the worldview that they already wanted to have anyway. But Augustine has a similar sort of intellectual and personal moral honesty, as Nagel did in the text that I read in the New York Review of Books, even though Augustine comes to a different conclusion. Okay, thereafter, there's one other topic I want to cover. Are there any questions about that? That was just kind of a historical, like literary scene that we just encountered. Any questions about that? Okay, there's one other topic I want to cover, and that's the topic of God and time. Okay, so the second topic was the conversion scene. And then the last topic that we're going to do in the confessions is the topic of God and time. Okay, and you can find treatment of the topic of God and time, especially in books 9 and 10. But I'm going to summarize Augustine's views of the nature of God's relationship with time rather than reading from any particular passage. Okay, so if you are, as I am, a theist who believes that God is all-powerful and omniscient and omnibenevolent, okay, so omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, and you also believe in the existence of time, although the question is always, of course, what is meant by that, now that we understand time at a very microscopic level in terms of quantum theory, for instance. Then you are faced with a problem, and that problem is, what is the relationship of God and time? Okay, and Augustine's model for the relationship of God and time is a very famous and influential model, and it's one that stood the test of time. And it's basically still the dominant model in Christian history. Augustine's model is, you could think of it as like the train track model. Here's God, and here's time on a train track, heading in this direction, just like a train would. Okay, so these are the train cars of the onset and flow of time. Okay, heading down this train track. Now, God, Augustine says, is outside of time. God is outside of time. He is outside of the train track. We are on the train. We are inside of time. Everything we see around us, all these physical objects we encounter in the universe around us, are all inside of time. We can't go backwards. And by the way, if you do think time travel occurs, why hasn't anyone from the future visited us?
How do you know they haven't?
There was this, I saw there was this like internet sensation like a couple months ago where somebody had thought they found a cell phone in a photo from 1913, and it looked like a cell phone, but it turns out it was like a beer bottle, but it just like looked like a cell phone, and it was like time travel occurs.
Remember did on the timeline, the time travel did not exist.
I don't think time travel occurs. Like, it just doesn't happen. I mean, I know that theoretically, in terms of quantum mechanics, you can come up with explanations for it, but there is no one from the future who has visited us.
I don't think time travel exists, but there's a video on YouTube of somebody there's a video on YouTube of people like predicting the future and stuff because they claim they're from the future.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really?
There's no bunch of them.
Like a lot.
Yeah, well, there's a lot on YouTube.
But some of them are accurate.
These guys are accurate?
Some of them are.
If they can predict the future, just, have them come to me and they can give me some hot stock tips so I can be wealthy when the future comes.
They're from the future and can't predict it. They can just tell you what happened.
Well, it's the same sort of thing, right? So, if intelligent life really does exist, right? Where is it? Why haven't we encountered it, right? Ergo, it doesn't exist. I know the universe is a really big place. I know that there are lots and lots and lots of planets. But the conditions for intelligent life to exist are actually incredibly improbable.
By our standards.
Much more improbable than the number of planets available in the universe. Like, it's really, really improbable that intelligent life would exist. We can look, in fact, I have a PowerPoint for you guys that we can look at about the improbability of intelligent life, but it's not in the context of a discussion of aliens. It's in the context of a discussion of the ontological argument for God's existence. I'm sorry, not the ontological argument, the teleological argument.
Like, what's it called? It's like really improbable for intelligent life exists in general, and the fact that we're here proves that there's intelligent life controlling existence.
It proves that we are a product of intelligence design, is the idea in that argument. Yeah, because we're so improbable. What's that, Matthew?
It could just be that the other species have a different standard for sustainable life than we do. Maybe they can survive in 250 degree surface temperatures, and they can breathe different kinds of air and whatnot.
Okay, so all right, I understand. Fair enough. Well, we can actually talk about those issues when we get to that, where it's coming right up this next week. So we might be able to talk about that when we talk about the teleological argument. But I guess the most convincing argument to me on the topic of intelligent life from beyond us, from elsewhere, is the where is it argument. So I tend to be a skeptic on this. It's like, where is it? Like, wouldn't it have visited us?
Star Trek theory, where Star Trek, those guys don't interfere until they reach warp technology, and then they're like, they just haven't presented.
So they haven't interfered with us because we're still too primitive?
Yeah.
They're watching us right now.
They're like, oh, how little they know.
All right, so yeah, speculating about them being the only ones around. Okay, so on Augustine's view of the relationship between God and time, God is like an observer who is standing in a field watching the train tracks and the train go by. And God can see this right now. God can see this right now. He can see this right now. He can see this right now, way off in the future. Because God is outside of time and can see all of it at once. Okay, now this is a view that has a lot of problems. Like this one. If you believe, as I do, as Augustine did, that Jesus of Nazareth is divine, is Jesus of Nazareth in time? If so, I think he is. How can God be outside of time and in time simultaneously? He got on the train. The Trinity, right? Okay, so it's a view that has a lot of problems, okay? Because of, it's also, though, a view that solves a lot of problems. So, for instance, like how does God throughout the Christian scriptures know the future, right? How is prophecy possible if divinely inspired, et cetera, et cetera. Like all sorts of problems are resolved. Like how can God be a creator God who knows the trajectory or course of the creation? Well, the God outside of time view is good at solving that. But it does have certain problems too, like how does God interact with creatures who are in time, and how can God himself be in time if Jesus of Nazareth is the incarnated God? Okay, and it's a view that has caused some to take other perspectives. Okay, so for instance, let me just list one alternative up here on the topic of God and time. Open theism. Is anyone familiar with this view? Open theism? Open theism is the view that God is in time, just like us. God starts at the beginning of time and travels through time and experiences the passage of time in the same way that we do on this view. Okay, and open theism solves the problem of how God can interact with creatures in time, but it does so at great cost. And the costs include things like undermining God's sovereignty or God's omnipotence, maybe even God's omniscience as well, because if God is in time, then how can God know the future if he's subject to the contingencies of time, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and yeah, it squares with certain scriptural passages, but not so much with others. It's really trendy these days among professional academics, so I list it here just because it is a trendy view that solves some of the problems of the God outside of time view. But it's not the classical view, and it's probably not going to be around that long. Most trends aren't. It's just something that is interesting that God could be in time. These are all speculative topics. Yes?
If he made time, this is not the experience.
So yeah, maybe God makes time. When you try to think of, like, if God is eternal, like classical Christianity teaches, it's really hard to think of God as making time, right? So maybe it's just that God and time have always simultaneously existed. But again, that's really hard for us to wrap our minds around because we can't imagine existence without the passage of time. We are such temporally bound beings, it is impossible for us to think about anything without the passage of time. So, I don't know. Okay, good. Questions about the topic of God and time? Very speculative topic. All that you guys need to know going away from this for testing purposes is that Augustine holds the view that God is outside of time, and God sees all time simultaneously and can interact with all parts of time simultaneously, for what it's worth. Okay, we are done with Augustine. That's it for us. We're going to move on to Aquinas now. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I will give you guys an introduction to Aquinas, and we'll talk a little bit about, I hope, some of Aquinas' 5 ways, the famous Quinque Vive. Okay, and I have not put the readings up on Blackboard yet, but I will be putting readings up on Blackboard shortly, so you guys can encounter that yourselves. Okay, let's take a quick break. Okay, St. Thomas Aquinas, his dates are 1225 to 1274, is one of the most influential thinkers who ever lived. Probably the greatest thinker in the history of Christian thought. Okay, and he is also the central thinker in the Roman Catholic tradition. And his ideas are central to this day in the dictates of the Vatican, the encyclicals of the Pope, the beliefs and doctrines of the Roman Church. He's also more generally influential throughout Christianity and just in philosophy in general, but especially in the Roman Catholic tradition. Notice that he is about 900 years after Augustine. A lot transpires in those 900 years. The Roman Empire collapses entirely, at least in the West. In the East, it continues as something else. And Aquinas is born and lives in an age where I guess you could say that the logistics of life were much worse than they had been under the Roman Empire. The reason why is because, at least in Northern Africa and the Near East and Europe, once the Roman Empire collapsed, civilization kind of entered a period of decline for a long time. For hundreds of years, a lot of books were lost. A lot of the barbarian tribes that overthrew the Roman Empire had no respect at all for learning, and they would burn libraries and just destroy learning. It was kind of sad. Technologies were lost, etc. But people began to rebuild, and by Aquinas' day, things had become much better. Now, there is one very important event for the life of Aquinas that happens about 130 years prior to Aquinas' entry onto the scene, and that happens in the year 1096. Okay, what happened in 1096? Anybody know? You know your history?
That sounds like a really, I know something. That's one of those where I'm like, oh, something big happened there, but I don't remember what.
I'm pretty sure it's two things. It was just that they burned the libraries, and if not that, it's the volcano exploded.
Neither one, unfortunately. So I was reading that's a good thought. I was reading a book one time. It was called "What Do Our 17-Year-Olds Really Know?" It's one of those expose books about, like, you know, how uneducated Americans really are. And well, the truth of the matter is a lot of public schooling is just babysitting, you know. But anyway, like, I was shocked as I was reading this book. I kept thinking to myself, this cannot possibly be the case. So, for instance, do you guys know which century the American Civil War took place in?
18th century.
It's the 19th century. The 19th century, yeah. So the 1800s, yeah.
That would have been my name.
It was the First Crusade, yes. You looked it up, yes. That's correct. First Crusade. Okay. Anyway, so it's good to, like, I know dates in history can kind of feel like jello, and it's like, you don't know what's going on, and like this empire attacked that empire, and this dude became powerful for a while and killed everybody, but then that dude overthrew him. Okay, but try to remember a few dates, and it can help you kind of get a grasp on the general trajectory of a lot of other things. Oh, it's the First Crusade. Yeah.
I thought you were talking about that.
Oh, no. This is not the American Civil War. No, is that what is that what people are thinking? Oh, no. This is not the American Civil War. Okay. Look. Help a brother out. What's this date right here? You guys know?
That's when we got our
Founding.
That's when we said we wanted to.
Yes. There's actually this crazy video, you can find this on YouTube, of this girl going around with like a hot mic on the campus at Texas Tech, and she's asking like people when this country was founded, or like who's the president, and these students at Texas Tech are like 1978, and the girl's looking at him quizzically, and they said, no, 1478. These people are getting a college degree, right? And okay, so First Crusade is 1096. Okay, all right. It is important for Aquinas and for our study of Aquinas because the Crusaders who traveled from Europe to the Holy Land to try to free the Holy Land from Islamic influence, the Salafid dynasty had overtaken Palestine, and that included the holy city of Jerusalem. The Crusaders sought to free Jerusalem of Islamic influence. These Crusaders, they did a lot of bad things. Okay, so the Crusades is not necessarily a heroic period in Christian history. The Crusaders, I'm not a fan. If you actually, the world, it wasn't just the Crusaders at the time, though. Basically, everybody was killing the little babies and like killing the women and children and sacking the cities. It wasn't just the Crusaders. The Muslims were doing it too. Like everybody was doing it. And they went to church on Sunday. They did. So it was a different world. Okay, but the Crusaders brought Aristotle to Europe. They brought Aristotle back to Europe. Okay, Aristotle had been lost, but the Crusaders found the texts of Aristotle from Islamic scholars who had preserved the texts. Okay, God bless the Islamic scholars. They saved the texts of Aristotle, and the Crusaders brought the texts of Aristotle back to Europe. Okay, now this is really influential in the life of Aquinas because Aquinas' main contribution is he ties the ideas, the philosophical ideas of Aristotle with Christian theology. That's his main contribution. When you think of Aquinas, think Aristotle and Christianity. He ties the Aristotelian metaphysics, Aristotelian philosophical assumptions, with Christian theological teachings about the Trinity, the Incarnation, the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, etc. Okay, that's his big contribution. Let me talk a little bit about his life and times. He was Italian. Okay, he was born into a noble family. Back in the day, so they didn't have separation of church and state like we have in America. And for that reason, often the way to advance in political power was to do so through the church. And his family had strong political aspirations. They were a wealthy, noble family, and they had strong political aspirations and sought to use him and his siblings to advance the cause of the family. Okay, so he was carted off to a monastery at age 5 where he was expected to rise in power in the church and to become a powerful representative of the family. Unfortunately for his family, Aquinas encountered an order within the Catholic Church called the Dominicans, who were actually genuine Christians, not just corrupt people interested only in worldly gain. And the Dominicans taught Aquinas the importance of learning, of scholarship, and of care for the underprivileged. Okay, and Aquinas announced to his family at age 16 that he was going to join the Dominicans and devote his life to scholarship and to caring for the underprivileged. Well, his family totally flipped out, okay, as you might imagine. And I guess it was sort of like those tiger parents. They locked him in a tower, in a castle, the Castle Gandolfo, okay, where he remained imprisoned in a single room for a year at age 16, and the family was hoping he would relent. Aquinas refused to relent. So as the story goes, they sent in a prostitute, apparently to try to tempt him. Okay, this is like bad parenting. And as the story goes, Aquinas like grabs a hot poker from the fireplace, like chases the prostitute with the poker, and like she runs out. Okay. Okay. All right. Now Aquinas eventually got his way and escaped from the castle of Gandolfo, actually, and traveled to Paris, where he became a university professor and a member of the Dominican order. This dude was legendary. He was unbelievable. This dude's intellect was beyond comparison. Stories about him are extraordinary. He would dictate to scribes in 5 languages simultaneously while thumbing through the pages of a book and reading to himself. He wrote, on average, 1,100 words every single day of incredibly difficult philosophical material, some of the hardest material. It's definitely the hardest material we'll encounter in this course. But it's some of the hardest material in philosophical history, and he did this every single day of his adult life. Okay, yeah, so the stories about him are pretty legendary. He died at the age of 49, relatively young, but his worldview and ideas and thoughts were so influential that they continue to shape many, many centuries later the ideas of many, many people. Okay, I have found his life to be very inspiring, having read a bit about him. Okay, questions or comments about his background before we look at some of his ideas? Okay, now, Aquinas, one of his contributions, in this class we're only going to look at like a very few contributions. We don't have time to go into hardly anything in Aquinas. Okay, but one of his contributions was arguments for God's existence. The 5 arguments, famously, the 5 arguments for God's existence. Okay, and the first of these 5 arguments, the first of the Quinque Vive, the 5 ways, is the cosmological argument. Okay, the cosmological argument. What is this argument? Well, I'm going to go ahead and put it up here. We have not read a text on it yet, so I wanted to go ahead and cover it in class, and then you guys can read the text after class. The cosmological argument is pretty straightforward. It's probably the easiest to understand of the 5 ways. So that's me, and that's my parents, and that's my grandparents and their parents, and so forth. Okay, so I had a cause. My parents, right? I don't know, back of the automobile or whatever. Okay. Who knows? Your origin story. Do you really want to know? Okay, so they had a cause, their parents, and they had a cause, their parents, etc. And you could do this for anything, right? You could do this for the tree that comes from the acorn, that comes from the tree that comes from the acorn. You could do this for anything. It all has a cause, right? Okay? And if you run the sequence back far enough, Aquinas says that there are only 2 options. Either you encounter eventually a first cause, we'll say A, or alternatively, the causes go on to infinity. Just like keeps going and going and going. Like all the way back, there is no beginning cause. There are just these 2 options, Aquinas says. Either there's a first cause. He uses the term movement. Okay, all of these things, they move each other. Either there's a first mover who is himself unmoved, an unmoved mover who moves the rest in the sequence. Or there is no first mover, it's just infinity. And Aquinas thinks there can't be any other option. It's just these two. Either there's a first thing, or it just goes all the way back. Now, Aquinas doesn't think it goes all the way back. He thinks there was a first thing. And he thinks that he's got an argument for it. There are several steps to the argument, but I'm just going to cover one of them, and I'm not going to cover some objections to it, because the objections are complicated, and I just kind of want us to understand the basics of the argument. Aquinas thinks, though, that this, the infinite regress, where it goes back to infinity, is impossible. He thinks the infinite regress is impossible because each one of the movers or causes within this sequence is itself finite and intermediate. Each one was moved by a prior mover. It's an intermediate mover. They're all intermediate movers. And they're all finite. Okay, so my children succeed me. When I pass, they will still be around, Lord willing. That's the way it usually ought to be. Their children will succeed them, etc. Each one of these causes is finite. But if it's infinity, if that's the reality, if that's the ultimate explanation here, is that all of these add up to infinity, then what you have is a series of finite things constituting an infinite set, which Aquinas thinks is contradictory. He doesn't think you can have an infinity out of finite things because you have a set that's made up of its opposites, a set defined by virtue of its opposites, which he thinks is contradictory. So he thinks you have to have a first thing. Okay, now obviously this is a very abstract sort of a discussion. It's not something that is easy to settle. It is convincing to me, by the way. I think that you do have to have a first thing. And there are various versions of the argument, but I wanted to just get the basic argument up here, at the end of our class today so that we can kind of understand at least this before we encounter more complicated arguments for God's existence in the subsequent 5 ways discussion. Does everybody get this? Do people have any questions or comments? There just had to be a first thing as the argument. Okay? Now notice that the argument doesn't tell us anything about the first thing. This could be an argument for deism, where God just makes things and then leaves it. Okay, the watchmaker God who winds the watch up and then leaves. It could be an argument for deism. It is not an argument for a personal God. It does not tell us anything about God's characteristics. But Aquinas thinks that it does demonstrate God's existence. Okay, we will talk about other more complex arguments next week. That's all I got for today. I'm going to let you guys go about 5 minutes early because the next topic, the ontological argument, is really complicated. So it's going to take a lot longer than 5 minutes to go over. Okay, please look for the readings, which I'll be uploading online, and I will see you guys next week.